I'm going to call to order the work session for Annapolis City Council for Thursday, November 15th, 2018. Everybody who is willing and able, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. City Attorney, could you please present the first item on the agenda?
The first item on the agenda is ID-302-18, a presentation on freedom of the press sculpture proposal.
Is Mr. Babington in the... there you are. Yeah, please have a seat. Yes, Alderwoman Pindell-Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just as a prelude to Mr. Walker Babington's presentation today, I have received an email from him back on October the 5th, and he indicated that I am an artist from the Annapolis area with deep roots in the journalism world. The tragedy this past June left me with a feeling of despondency that eventually developed into a mission. I'm proposing to build a sculpture in honor of the victims of the Capitol Gazette shooting and offer it to the city of Annapolis. I've gotten it to the desk of Rick Hutzel, the editor, and have the blessings of the mayor's office and wanted to reach out to City Council for approval before moving forward. The project will be fully funded via private donations, interested groups, and crowdfunding. I'm contacting the City Council in the hopes of garnering approval and permission to install the finished piece on city property. I indicated to Mr. Babington that we would allow him 15 minutes today for his presentation. Thank you so much, sir.
Sir, could you speak into the mic? You have to speak into the mic.
Hello? Cool.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. So this is not coming up on the screen.
Someone will help you.
It's 2018. We should just be able to clap, you know? Okay. close. Let's see if that works. Okay. Sure, it's just a PDF. PDF, yeah. Can I? I don't have the Wi-Fi here.
We can call IT, and is this, I imagine, pretty central to your presentation?
It is, but I also have backup.
Okay.
But I would love to I keep poke around that while I,
Okay. Thank you.
So it's more of just a slideshow than a real PowerPoint presentation. Most of it seems to
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, if you help yourself to that. So yeah, I've sent various PDFs around and whatnot that had all different levels of information, but I don't know what got to who. So I'm going to give you guys a quick who, what, where, when, why, and how on it. Starting with the who, I'm an artist. I grew up about 15 minutes from where we're sitting and have lived all up and down these streets. And I come from a journalist family. My mom and dad met at opposing papers. Dad actually had an office right on Church Circle, and he covered politics for like 25 years. So obviously when the incident happened over the summer, it hit everybody, and I felt it on a bunch of different levels, and felt the need to do something and worked my way toward landing on this, which leads me to the what. Essentially, the sculpture is a giant typewriter, kind of a classic old Underwood styled one, and where the paper would come out, there are 5 arching beams with birds, cast bronze birds at the end of each one, representing the 5 victims, obviously. And in the keys, I wanted to spell a quote, and I looked around, and hindered by the size and not wanting to make it too political in any direction, I finally found a beautiful quote by a 15th century astronomer, Giordano Bruno, who said, "The pursuit of truth is the only thing worthy of a hero." So moving on to the where, I'm speaking with the Art and Public Places Commission on Tuesday, and I won't totally know until I talk to them, but we're looking at locations. The main one that we're looking at is actually the Westgate Circle. Yeah. Sure. Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, it's perfect. Just Apple L. Boom. So,
Thank you.
This is mostly covered the first. Thank you. Few minutes of what I was talking about there. That's the schematics. The quote laid out. This is basically the general idea. That's about a 6-foot tall person. The location that I'm talking to the city about, or hoping to talk to the city about, is the Westgate Circle, where there's currently the ribs of a boat that was put up by the Art and Public Places Commission in 2012 for 2 years. I went up there and walked around, and there's some wood rotting on it. I'm going to speak to them on Tuesday, and we're going to see if it's feasible to find a new space for that, new home for that, and move forward with that positioning. The timeline, I'm hoping to have it up and unveiled at the anniversary of the event, June 28th, which is about 7.5 months from now. And if I'm not met with too much force in the coming weeks, in the coming meetings, I'm hoping to start a fundraising campaign pretty much immediately after that. My team is a whole group of incredible metal workers that I've built crazy large projects with. But the main people that I wanted to highlight were a group out of San Francisco called Building 180, and they help basically large-scale community-oriented projects happen. They just oversaw the installation of the memorial in Las Vegas for that shooting. They're good friends of mine, and they've helped a bunch of my friends who are artists with the side of things that artists aren't very good at, such as paperwork, logistics, handling of money, the city side of things, you know, whether you have to hire city officials for an excavation or whatnot, all the permitting, who is responsible for insurance. So if there are any questions about that I don't know offhand, I can reach out to them and get back to you guys in the future. Another person who's on my team is a man named Alan Blow, who has one of my sculptures in his backyard. He's an engineer. He's literally a rocket scientist. He's an engineer who works for NASA, and he has helped myself and others with stamping of plans, and he's agreed to be my engineer to help make sure that everything's up to code and nothing's going to fall over. And also, a friend I've known since we were teenagers, my friend Alex Daly, she just got written up in Forbes for being the 30 under 30. She was younger than I am. I'm no longer. But she's been labeled the crowd sorceress and has agreed to help me get money together. I am not asking the city for any money. I'm just hoping to get the approval to display it. It would ideally be on indefinite loan from me. And once I speak to the Art and Public Places Commission, I can have an idea of scale, therefore budget, but I have rough numbers I put together for different sizes of what we're trying to do. That is largely what I have to say to you. I don't know if you guys have any questions coming off of that.
Are there any questions from the council? Alderwoman Finlayson.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for sharing this with us. You had communicated with me sometime in the past with a picture. My question is, the quote that you used, which I really like, it's not going to be visible unless you're in a plane. So do you plan a plaque or some story wall or something to go along with this? Because if it is up on Westgate Circle, and that creates another situation because you really can't walk up on Westgate Circle. So how do you envision that sharing? How do you envision sharing the quote with those who see the statue or the
Thank you, ma'am.
structure?
I do intend to, on the opposite side of the typewriter of the keys, the high side, a brass plaque, which I don't remember if I put into the 3D plan quite yet. Will bear a brass plaque. Not in the 3D plan, but essentially right down there, I would indeed have a brass plaque, and I want to put the title of it, The Pursuit of Truth, on there, and I hadn't thought of putting the entire quote, but it actually makes a lot of sense. I was looking at a bunch of different quotes, and I liked that one too. I'm glad you like it. But I think that putting it on the brass plaque would at least make it visible to those passing by. And I did notice, I walked the circle before I came in today, realized it was really hard to get to, so it probably won't be something that people are passing by often. Thank you for that, and I will look into maybe below the brass plaque, putting the quote again on the outside would be a really good plan for that.
My second question is, would you be willing to downscale it for a different location?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of go big or go home. I always like to make things bigger. But absolutely, and especially if it's going to be in a place where people are able to walk by it and see it and whatnot. But if ideally it would be made for a location. Finding the location is step one, and then from then I would move forward with schematics and scale.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Hi.
Hello.
Question I have is two questions. You said the typewriter's made out of steel.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it stainless steel, or is it like a Tennemic painted steel to make, or is it what painted steel?
It would be powder coated,
Oh, okay.
which is
Just look
similar
like-
to painted, but more heavy duty. They basically put it in this room, blow powder around, and shock it with electricity to basically make it fuse to the steel. Most of my work has been wooden and more ephemeral than this. I burn them down. But I've worked with a lot of people who do public metal sculptures, and I've talked to them, and they say that powder coating is the way to make it last centuries. So that would be the plan for that, and the birds would be cast bronze, and budget depending, I'd like to make the keys cast as well, but that's for future.
And my second question, it's silly, it's constructed, what is it sitting on? Is it?
That's
Is it-
also,
Is it a platform, or, do you have a foundation, or what is it, how does it get there?
when I spoke to the Building 180 folk, they said that there's basically two options. One is to pour a slab of concrete,
Yeah,
which when we go down the line talking about time, if this is a 20-year sitting on the circle plan, then maybe pouring concrete would be reasonable.
Yeah.
And I'd work that into my budget and whatnot. The other plan is to basically put subterranean steel structures that are made to live underground. I believe the ship that's up there right now actually has a little grid of underpinning underneath it that it's all held by.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a median as you turn onto West Street, Inner West Street, where there might be room there for a plaque or description.
Yeah, I do want there to be a place where people can go and visit it without having to put themselves in the line of traffic. So another idea my wife had suggested was having a spot across the street where it's kind of a good angle for viewing, where it does also explain what it is, why it's there, and the people who helped make it happen. Thank you. And the stress of being a mayor has done a number on your accent, sir.
Thank you. And my hair. Well, are there any other questions? Alderman Arnett?
I'm assuming the symbolism of the birds, the 5, are because of the deaths.
What was that?
The birds, there's 5 birds flying out.
It's not their literal angels necessarily. It is one of the other quotes that I was looking at, which was too long to fit, was an MLK quote that actually also had the word "press on" in it, which was obviously the big movement. It was, "As you press on for justice, do so with dignity, using only the weapon of love." It was a little too long. I was thinking about taking out the middle part and saying, "As you press on for justice, use only the weapon of love," but I didn't want weapon to be in there. So for a while there, it was kind of these torpedoes of peace. I see it more as, sure, they're spirits, but not necessarily their deaths. If that answers it.
And what kind of laptop is a typewriter?
It's an Acer. Doesn't get Wi-Fi. No HDMI input.
All right, well, anything else you'd like to?
No, if you guys
Okay.
don't have anything else for me, that's.
Well, thank you. I want to commend you on having this idea. I think in these times, in this climate, we really do need to stand up for our freedom of the press and for our community. So thank you for
Cool.
stepping up.
Thank you much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for setting
Certainly.
this up.
Absolutely.
Mr. City Attorney, could you please present the next item on the agenda?
The next item on the agenda is ID-300-18, an update on the flood mitigation project.
If you two could just please state your name for the record.
Oh, I like it.
Good afternoon. David Gerald, Director of Public Works, and to my right is Lisa Greco, who's civil engineer for the city. And so we're going to, if I can get this working properly, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll try and get this running right. Give an update on the flood mitigation project down at City Dock. We've been doing a lot of work, had a lot of public input to this process. Our designer, AECom, is moving forward with the design, and so we wanted to provide an update on the project. So I'll turn it over to Lisa and hopefully get these slides working. think you all have this on your iPad.
We
Great.
do, yeah.
Well, yeah, because it's not on the screen. Okay. Good afternoon. Our title slide shows what we're experiencing, flooding at Compromise Street. As you may recall, last month, or 2 months ago in September, we had 12 days of flooding, 6 of which Compromise Street was closed at least one period, some days 2 periods, due to the tidal flooding. We have a summary of the topics today. We'll cover the project drainage area, the tidal flooding, flood mitigation design, and project funding and schedule. So overall, the project covers a total of 90 acres. The whole downtown drainage area is 90 acres. It's, however, broken into 2 separate phases, which we'll discuss a little later. The next slide shows our existing storm drain system. Each of the red squares on there represents a storm drain inlet. And as you can see, and then the blue lines represent the pipes either connecting the inlets or the outfall pipes. You can see that we have a lot of outfall pipes, particularly on the north side, where the inlets gather the runoff and dump it directly into Ego Alley. This project is going to address the flooding which is created when we have the high tides, which then come up through those outfall pipes into the storm drain structures, flooding the adjacent streets. This is a concept drawing of what we're currently experiencing. You can see we've identified the existing bulkhead, and when the water levels are high, not coming over the bulkhead, but high, an example here at elevation 3, then we have flooding in Compromise, Randall, and Dock Streets. Some of the higher elevations, such as on Main Street and Prince George Street, we don't experience flooding that's coming up through the storm drains. This slide just summarizes some of the key elevations. There's the mean of all the high tides for the year 2016 is at elevation 0.8. We use a datum of the North NAVD88, which stands for North American Vertical Datum. We start to experience flooding at elevation 1.9. We will have water in the gutter on Compromise Street, and we'll have about 0.3 of a foot of water in Dock Street. The extreme high tide for this past year was in March at elevation 2.7. At that point, Compromise Street is totally underwater. The crown of Compromise Street is at elevation 2.4. So that means the entire roadway is underwater, as well as the adjacent sidewalks. This particular project, we will provide protection up to elevation 3.2. That elevation was selected as because the elevation of the Fleet Reserve deck, which is the nearest adjacent private property, as well as the deck behind 110 Compromise, are at elevation 3.2. Our boardwalk around Susan Campbell Park is at elevation 4 to 4.5, and the new seawall around the head of Ego Alley is up at elevation 5. So the city property, we're at a higher elevation. However, the weak link, so to speak, the low point would be at the adjacent private property. So this project will not allow the water to come up through the storm drains, and we will be protected from high water elevations up to 3.2, just due to the natural infrastructure that's in place. A 10-year high tide elevation is at 3.7, so at that point we would experience flooding even with this project in place. And again, our base flood elevation, which is set by FEMA, is at elevation 5.0. Our city code cites the flood protection elevation for first floors to be 2 feet above that, or elevation 7, and our electric code requires electrical equipment to be set 3 feet above the base flood elevation of 5.0, so that would be at 8. And then just one more data point, Hurricane Isabel was at 6.4. I'm sure many of you recall how much water was downtown. I think we just had the head of Alex Haley showing, and Main Street and Market Space were underwater at that point.
Ms. Greco,
Yes.
I have a question too, but I'll go Alderman Finlayson.
Yes, thank you. Lisa, Ms. Greco, how often do we have the 10-year high tide? Have we had that recently?
No,
No.
no. I've been with the city for 11 years, and the highest elevation I believe I've seen is 2.9. And Dock Street was underwater completely up to Randall, so the barricades were right in front of Mission Barbecue. So all of Dock Street was underwater, and Compromise would be a half a foot underwater at that.
And that's
elevation.
that's 3.2?
That would be at 2.9.
2.9.
That's the highest that I've seen in the 11 years that I've been here. And that's not storm related. We may have had a couple of hurricanes, and we do have data on tropical storms and the like that may come up to maybe elevation 3.1, 3.1. But the tidal flooding, which is what this project, I want to emphasize, this project is only going to address tidal flooding, not tides due to storm surges or even sea level rise. We do take into account sea level rise. We are monitoring that, and we're not experiencing flooding regularly due to sea level rise at this point. And we recognize that follow-on phase to this project in the next, 5 to 10 years would have to address, what we're seeing due to sea level rise.
And that was going to be my next question about sea level rise. So I think we're going to have to work overtime to help the community to understand that this is not about sea level rise.
We always start our community presentations with what the three phases that we see. One is tidal flooding, which accounts for 95% of the flooding that we're currently experiencing. And then you've got sea level rise, which would require some type of permanent infrastructure change, but we will need to plan for as we monitor the actual sea level rise in this area. And then we have flooding due to storm events such as Hurricane Isabel, which would likely require a temporary solution. We saw in the last administration there was a demonstration of the Tiger dams and aqua fences. I don't know if you were able to see that, but they're bladder type devices or like folding devices that you would install on a temporary basis for a storm. But the city at this time does not have any plans to purchase those types of devices. As far
Should I ask Mr. Gerald about do we still have the bladders?
We do not. Thank goodness, we do not. So we actually auctioned those off. We put them on Gov Deals and sold them and got some money out of them. But yeah, they never worked properly. You couldn't fill them the way they were supposed to be filled. You were supposed to be able to fill the first one, and then the water just and it never worked properly. So we got rid of them.
So are we already holding development, redevelopment, construction projects to the new standard?
Yes.
Okay, so if we're saying 8 feet for electrical, that may mean that on lower levels there's no electrical? Is there 8-foot ceiling or 7-foot ceiling?
It's an elevation. It's not 8 feet
It's
above
not.
where you would be standing on the first floor. So as an example, Compromise Street, the elevation in the middle of the road is at elevation 2.4. So you
Okay.
would need to have your equipment would then have to be another 5.5 feet off of the floor. That would
Okay.
be the bottom of your electric panel, say your fuse box, which I'm sure most people are at that elevation currently.
So the elevation is from, it
Sea-
would be the
it's from
same.
sea level. It's
from
it's
sea
above
level,
sea
yes.
level. So a
Yeah.
lot of the city's already well above sea level. So you're not going, up 8 feet from the ground level.
Okay. Thank you.
Alderman Arnett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I think we learned in Weather Together, I know we learned in Weather Together, that high tides have an 18-year cycle, and we're on the downslope of that cycle. I'm wondering about this, I don't know whether it's a half a foot, but 0.5 difference, what we're shooting for versus the 2.7 that we had. And I'm wondering further, when we start back up on that tides going up, will we have time to deal with sea level rise, with, partnering with the academy before we get back into the high arc of the 18-year cycle?
Well, that's a great question. So right now we're dealing with the immediate issue, which is the flooding that's coming up through the storm drains. At some point in the near future, we're going to have to start dealing with the over the top, and we've talked about that, and that was a great question because a lot of people think it's over the top already. It's really not. It's coming from below. But we are going to have to figure out how to deal with that, and we're going to have to deal with those private landowners down there that have the lower. I mean, we've already dealt with it on our infrastructure, but they haven't.
Right.
So we're going to have to deal with the Fleet Reserve and 110 Compromise and those other owners along there because the water is going to come up on their property and it's going to come onto our streets from their property. So somehow we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that.
But if we have only 3 meters of sea level rise, which now I think we're seeing more and more is at the low end of sea level rise or sea level by 2100, will this be sufficient? Going back to your slide before where you're going up Main Street, if we have 3 meters of high tide, that means there's going to be pressure to come up through the storm drains even farther, right? In addition to the cyclical tides and the long-term cycle, we will be getting more and more sea level rise, so they compound each other, don't they? That's why the 3.2 just seems like it's not that much, and particularly if we're not going to be getting to the sea level rise stuff with the academy, say within 20 years. I don't know what the time frame. I actually asked Sarah Phillips about that, and I'm waiting her email back, but it just seems like we really ought to be thinking about these things in combination, even though we know this has nothing in particular to do with the sea level we're at right now.
Yes, so there, I think there's I heard 2 questions. So one is the 3.2. Is the 3.2 going to be enough, and how long will it be enough?
Right.
The argument could be made that it's not even enough today, because that's probably about maybe a 4 or 5 year flood event.
Right.
Based on these numbers, with 3.7 being the 10 year, and we experienced the 2.7 already, halfway between, that's probably 3, 4, or 5 years, somewhere in that range. The second part that I heard was the 5 feet that we're designing this project to. If the flooding comes up to 5 feet, then all of a sudden these inlets that we're not protecting are going to be in jeopardy. And that's an interesting issue. We think that that's going to be, I mean, that's the 100-year flood elevation right now. With sea level rise, guess what? That's not going to be 100 years. That's not going to have a 1% chance of occurrence. It's going to be a much greater chance of occurrence in the future. So when is that going to happen? Not for a while, but probably not within my lifetime, maybe within yours, but it's not mine.
Young chicken like me.
But yeah, I mean, maybe at some point, the city will have to deal with this part of the project of the storm drain system and those higher elevations.
So I guess the bottom line question for me is, should we aim higher or protect higher? And is there, I bet there's a non-linear relationship between cost for every increment of elevation. It gets more and more as you protect more and more.
Yeah, I think we need to focus not so much on the 5-foot elevations, because I think we're going to be safe for a while. I think we need to start thinking about how we're going to deal with the 3.2 elevation seawall on those private properties.
So last question, even at 3.2, do we have the money to do this? Has Kevin come through with FEMA grant?
So all we're talking about here is phase 1, which is the compromise side. We haven't gotten approval of that grant yet, but we fully expect that that's going to happen. But we're not funded for phase 2 yet. We don't have any money set aside, even city money set aside for phase 2 over on the Dock Street side. So we plan to go to the state again this year. We've gone for, I guess, 3 or 4 straight years asking for money with, hat in hand, and start talking about phase 2, and that we need money to move forward with that.
Thank you.
Alderwoman Tierney?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My questions were as my colleagues' questions on the 3.2, but let me just ask, it's a pump, so, and you're trying to establish some kind of equilibrium, and with that 3.2 as the magic number. So if it is this equipment going to be obsolete if sea level rises, or can we just pump more? I mean, do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's not, that's what we're doing, we're pumping.
Correct. So one of the features of the current project, while we're not addressing sea level rise, we are trying to build in some scalability to the current project for sea level rise.
Yeah,
For
wow,
example,
say that again? Did you hear that, Ross?
Yep.
Thank you.
so as an example, the wet well, the underground vault that all the stormwater is going to be directed to is being oversized, because it's a big hole in the ground, and we'd rather just dig it once and not have to come in 10, 20 years from now when we are experiencing sea level rise and make it larger. So we're only going to put in pumps right now to handle the 10-year storm. That's what our storm drain system is sized for. But we will have the room to either add an additional pump or increase the size of the 3 pumps that are going to be put in as part of this project.
Okay, so it won't be
Let me
obsolete.
just add real quick.
Yeah.
So the pumps are sized to handle the storm water. They're not designed to handle the flood water. So once we start getting flooding over the top, we can't build a big enough system to pump the whole bay, right?
Oh, then you start getting the flood water and you're
So
pumping
that's
that
why
in,
we
yeah.
have to deal with the flooding over the top. This system is not
I
gonna deal
see.
with this. This system's gonna deal with the storm water when we have high tide to pump the storm water out. But
Yeah.
if we start getting flooding over the
Then you
top,
do, yeah.
these pumps aren't gonna handle that. There's
Okay.
just no way to size them that big.
My last question, as far as the correlation with sea level rise, one could say that the frequency of these flooding events have increased due to sea level rise, or one could not say that. Is there?
One could definitely say that.
Okay.
So the flooding here in, this nuisance flooding, what we call nuisance flooding, tidal flooding here in Annapolis, has increased over the last 50 years more than anywhere else in the United States. And that's all due to sea level rise. The subsidence here in Maryland, but also sea level rise. And that's only projected to get worse. So whether that's man-made or not, scientists say that it is, but it doesn't matter. It's the reality of life that the sea is rising.
And I had a few comments. I think you've addressed a lot of my concerns, questions about the scalability. It sounds like the limiting factor are the private properties at 3.2. It's not the size of the pumps. But if we did have an overtopping situation again, would the pumps automatically shut off, or what kind of fail-safe is in there?
I would think they would have a cutoff at a
Yeah.
certain threshold, because they
Okay.
wouldn't be able to just keep pumping.
But I think it's important. I think this is connected almost directly with climate change, at least in preparing for it, right? I mean, I think no matter, at least remembering some of the other reports that we've done about the need to raise the seawall downtown, is that those do require the restructuring of our storm drain system, and of having this kind of system to capture the stormwater that's going to accumulate at the bottom of city docks. So I think this is really, in my mind, kind of a first step that we need to do no matter whatever we choose to do in the future for sea level rise, which will be, I guess, phase 3 kind of this project. But I would, at some point, maybe you already have this, but I would love to see a list of the private property owners downtown who eventually will need to be spoken to about raising their level, and I guess we'll have to come up with some kind of plan about how to and when that needs to get done. Any other, so you
else?
keep
So,
going, I
I'll
guess.
continue on.
Thank you.
So, the project, the overall project for the city, is comprised of, storm drain improvements. So it'll be the realignment of the storm drain system around the perimeter of Ego Alley. If you recall from one of the earlier slides with the red, inlets and the blue pipes, the storm drain system, what we'll do is we'll keep the same locations. We will likely have to rebuild most of the actual catch basins, but then we will hook them in series via pipe, and ultimately it will outfall into the wet well, at which point then the pumps kick on when it hits a certain level to pump it overboard. And that's only required when the tides are high. Otherwise, it's totally a gravity system. That's a key point that I'd like to make is the pumping piece of it, the pump stations are really only required because if we had a rain event at the same time as you had a high tide, there would be no way for the water to flow by gravity into the Ego Alley. And so we have to pump it against the high tide at the outfall. Another portion of so the storm drain improvements include realigning the storm drains at the lower elevations on Compromise Street and Dock Street. That's called the bypass system. And then the localized system would be the storm drains that come from higher elevations, for example, down Main Street. That can continue to just outfall right into Ego Alley because the manholes, the street elevations are higher. They're at elevation 5, just like the top of our seawall. So the water's not going to back up to that point because, as we've discussed, we're protecting this system up to 3.2 because at 3.2 it's coming over the Fleet Reserve's deck anyway. And then there will be wet well, 2 wet wells, one on each side
Ms.
of Ego
Greco.
Alley.
Ms. Greco, I do have one question about the storm drain upgrades. I mentioned this before. I'm just curious if you took a look at the type of pipe. I think from what I recall, you're proposing to use mostly just concrete pipe for the new system. Have you looked at using the HP plastic, just like double-wall plastic pipe down there? Because I know they have a tighter gasket and are easier to transport.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if, I know it might conflict with some of our specifications, but on a cost basis, I'm not sure if it would end up saving money or not.
At this point, we're in the design. We haven't received our first estimate. I'm sure
Okay.
they will be looking at the different materials and what is cost effective and what is
Okay.
needed. And so in addition to the storm drain realignment, we will have 2 wet wells with 3 pumps in each wet well. There's a wet well proposed on each side, one in Dock Street, one on Compromise Street. This project, as we said, focuses just on Compromise Street. There will be 2 control buildings, 2 separate control buildings, one for each wet well to control the pumps, as well as to house an emergency backup generator on each side. And then there will be some minor grading modifications. Again, going back to that elevation of 3.2, we have 2 locations around Ego Alley. One would be at the end of Newman Street. The bulkhead is very low there. It's at elevation 1.8, so we envision raising that up to 3.2, matching the adjacent deck, and we'll have to carry that back onto 110 Compromise. Their deck would have to be raised, their boardwalk. Also, at the head of Ego Alley and the dinghy dock, the park there is all submerged, and that does flood and will continue to flood, but the sidewalk around it is at a higher elevation, and we'll have to make some minor modifications at the top of the handicap ramp from that lower park area to bring that up to 3.2. This shows a schematic of the project. We
Ms.
have
Greco.
the bypass system, which is
Mr.
the...
Greco, we had a question, Alderwoman Tierney.
Sure. Yeah, I just thought I'd bring this up because there's a lot of discussion about green infrastructure.
Mhm.
I mean, there is, and I see that Jackie's here and all, and I just want to make it clear that I believe that this design supersedes, if you will, any sort of implementation of green infrastructure. In other words, the engineering of perhaps absorbing the stormwater through pervious brick or anything like that on Main Street. I'm specifically talking about Main Street. There has been some ideas about implementing green infrastructure. And I believe that this is not that, and this is.
That's correct.
And,
That's-
okay,
right.
but, there's a but, right? That we are going to look at some other, green infrastructure, not infrastructure, but green design as far as the, silver cells.
We
and-
are.
Okay,
That's right, yeah, so
Yeah,
there's
let's
gonna be a
make that
silver
clear.
cell installed in front of Kilwins or Starbucks in that area. And we're looking at other green infrastructure further up the street. So that would just reduce the amount of stormwater that's coming
Coming
down
in,
Main Street,
yeah.
but you still have to deal with whatever's
okay, so
remaining.
you're good,
Yeah.
okay. I wanted to make that
Yes. Also, you know, from a regulatory standpoint, I don't believe, we're not required to treat stormwater. We've recently received the MS4 permit, so we have a percentage of our runoff now, but it's not, in talking with the consultants, they have indicated this project, we're not necessarily required, but that there are other opportunities around the city, we like to say low-hanging fruit, that would be more cost-effective ways of treating and meeting our 20% requirement for filtering storm drain runoff. That's okay. This is a proposed layout of the realigned system. The red system is this current project on the Compromise Street, so we would be realigning some of the storm drain as far up, Main Street at Market Space. There's some, it's hard to differentiate, but there's some purple pipe shown there that goes from the intersection of Main and Green Street past Memorial Circle. That will remain in place, and because that's, as we indicated, at the higher elevation, that will just outfall directly into Ego Alley. We will line those pipes and make them watertight so that there isn't any water infiltration, but other than that, those pipes will just remain in place. All the red is the realigned pipes, and then the green pipes represent the outfall pipes. This is not actually our most current design because it shows the wet well a little further back in the Newman Park Plaza, but we have another schematic that shows our latest location. This slide represents the two drainage areas. As we started at the beginning of the slide presentation, the whole city is 90 acres. It's not, that's the entire city, but these two projects will address the two drainage areas shown here. The blue is the current project, Phase 1, or the south side, and that consists of 23 acres. And then the red drainage area represents the north side on Dock Street, and that's a much smaller area. It's just 9 acres. So in this project, Phase 1, we've to date looked at 14 alternative site locations in the Newman Park area. We've looked at different layouts of the building, different locations within the plaza, the basketball court, the playground. We've had numerous meetings with the community over the last year, and we've received a lot of input from various stakeholders, residents, community groups, the school system. Most recently, we went before HPC just this past Tuesday with our proposal after taking in all this input and recommendations. One of the key considerations was to not impact the playground in a permanent way with the control building being in the playground, and not even during construction. We've worked closely with, again, the school, some engineers that are planners at the school system, and together we've come up with a site. We would locate the control building adjacent to their existing dumpster screen in their parking lot. So this shows the layout. So at the lower left bottom corner, we show in pink is their dumpster enclosure that's situated on the back of the basketball court and in the beginning of the playground. Our building, we're proposing to tie right into it. We'll have a common wall. We'll use their back wall. We'll use similar finishes, brick finishes, and the building will be just a little bit longer than their existing building. That will house the emergency backup generator. In addition, there's a smaller rectangle there that represents the control room. And then, again, in yellow, we have an additional screening wall. So this is looking down at it in plan view. It's going to be located between their dumpster enclosure and the basketball court. That's the large rectangle in the middle of the drawing. The larger rectangle towards the upper right corner, that's the wet well. That's all underground, and that is pretty much at the corner of Compromise Street and Newman Street, where the existing hardscaped plaza is. It will be underneath the plaza. Those curvilinear lines represent the existing retaining walls and the walkway up to the basketball court, and there's also a rain garden there. The gray line, the 3 gray lines represent the underground outfall pipes, which will go from each of the pumps and down under Newman Street and will outfall through the bulkhead. And then the gray line that connects the wet well and the control room is the electrical duct bank that powers the pumps. So these are renderings of the proposed pump station control building. As you can see in the background, it's the school buildings. This looks very similar to the existing dumpster enclosure. Again, our architect is a local architect, Ed Masick, with Wheeler Goodman Masick, and he is following the Historic Preservation Commission's guidelines very closely, which requires us to draw on the context of existing buildings in the area. And since we're tying into the dumpster enclosure, we are mirroring the existing architecture of that structure. It's a utilitarian structure. The 4 squares that are shown there are just recessed squares. They are placeholders for public art installations. We've been in conversations with the Art and Public Places Commission. They're very interested in installing some art there, so we will work closely with them. The lower rendering shows the building as seen from the school's parking lot. So in the foreground is their existing dumpster enclosure, and then you'll see our control building coming off of that. The portion of the building that's behind the dumpster enclosure that houses the generator, the emergency backup generator, will not have a roof on it, so you'll just see the prefab concrete parapet around the top. But the electric control building will have a roof on it, and as you see in the lower building, a lower rendering, we're proposing a standing seam metal roof that would slope off to a gutter that would collect the water and tie into the existing storm drain system adjacent to the parking lot. This is an aerial view of the Newman Park, and just to give you an idea, so the plaza area right at the intersection of Compromise and Newman Streets would be where the wet well is located. It would be totally underground. We're proposing to hold a one last community meeting to update the public on this proposed location to show that we've heard all of their comments. We've taken into consideration all their concerns to preserve the playground. In addition, we would like to discuss reimagining the plaza. We do have some opportunity to install some green infrastructure, and so the consultant is working up some options. We will provide one, like a do-nothing or a replacement in kind, where the plaza could be put back in place just as it is. We are proposing, currently there's a rain garden, that's the other half of the plaza area, that will be put back in place. That is an existing green space, and we will have some stormwater management requirements that we'll need to meet, and so that will go back in, and likely will hold the walkway as well. But we're looking for input on some green opportunities to replace that existing hardscape plaza if that's what the community desires. This shows the location of the grading modifications that I spoke about earlier. So at the end of Newman Street, you see the large red oval. We would have to raise that area and bring it up to elevation 3.2, as well as near the Alex Haley statue, the handicap ramp that's adjacent to that. The top of the ramp will have to be raised up and the sidewalk would have to be raised about 3 inches to bring it up to elevation 3.2. And so, project funding. So, for the design of phase 1 and 2, we received $1 million from the state. For phase 1 construction, that's the Compromise Street portion. As we've said, we have a grant application in to FEMA that we're still waiting to hear approval of. The city has is contributing $1.5 million in matching funds, and we've also received funding from the state in the amount of $2 million for a total cost of $6.5 million. The second phase, which would be for Dock Street on the north side construction, it's currently estimated that that would be $4.5 million. As you recall, that was a smaller drainage area, so there's not as much pipe needed, not as many catch basins.
Alderwoman Finlayson?
Yes. I thought we had already gotten a grant from FEMA.
No, we put in an application in April of 2017, and we've been working. We've not received approval at this time.
Okay, so it takes that long for them to?
Yes.
I see heads bobbing in the back
Yes.
also, so.
Right.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, Alderwoman Arndt, Tierney?
Thank you. Did we submit anything on phase 2? Anything to FEMA for phase 2?
We haven't yet, no, because we've been waiting for the other grant to come through. So, yeah, and we haven't put in our CIP yet because we're not quite sure. We're going to talk to the state this year, as I mentioned, about how much they may be willing to fund. You know, that would be the third phase.
For this General Assembly?
Yeah.
We're going to ask for this General Assembly for phase 2.
For phase 2.
Phase 2 construction.
Yeah.
Alderman Arnett?
How far off do we think phase 2 is? How many years? And I guess the follow-on question is, given the tendency for interest rates to be rising, are we thinking that we need to be worrying about putting this in the CIP and getting bond money ready to go?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think that, you know, right now we're focused on phase 1 and the design. As soon as the design's complete next September-ish, and we're going to talk about the schedule in just a minute, it'd be ideal if we could jump right into design of the next phase to get that knocked out, so then we could then phase the construction after that.
So there's no design like for phase 2?
There's a little bit, but we're not sure how much of that's going to be left over. That's sort of contingency for design of phase 1 right now. So if costs stay the way they are today, we'll have some left over. What was it, 150,000, something like that. Yes.
And for the storm drain realignment, is that all one phase, or did you split that up for
No,
phase
that's
1
two
and 2?
phases.
That's
that
2 as well, okay.
Each of the separate drainage areas are a separate phase. There's 2 independent standalone systems. Currently they stand alone. They don't cross.
Okay, and so not having the second phase done, is that going to compromise the effectiveness of the phase 1 work at all?
No, because this current project, phase 1, will address the flooding that occurs on Compromise Street. There's a lot of dry ground between Compromise and Dock Street, so if we just address Compromise Street this time, at least access to the city will be taken care of, but we will continue to experience flooding in Dock Street.
Okay.
So the phase 1 project timeline, we initiated design development in December of 2017, and we completed our public input in this past August. So that was our last meeting with the school system. We had a meeting with the last community meeting was in May, as well as a meeting with the school system, and then we fine-tuned the design that came of those meetings with the school system in August. We're still awaiting approval of the FEMA grant application. We anticipate completion of our design documents this coming September. We have interim dates. Right now, we're expecting 60% design plans to be submitted in mid-December, and we'll be making application to Historic Preservation Commission in February with them. But the total plans won't be finished until September. And then we anticipate construction bidding through the fall of 2019, with construction starting in January of 2020. And completion, we're showing fall of 2021. We're looking to shorten the construction period as much as possible through potential, the city could purchase long lead time items to shorten the construction period, but we also do anticipate extensive archaeology will be required on these sites, and so that's a big unknown that could impact the construction schedule.
Thank you. So this could affect 2 boat shows, right? Depending upon how far, particularly archaeology?
Yes.
So you're basically going to dig a big pit along the water side?
No, the pit will be in the plaza across the street from.
Oh, it's not over by Newman? At the
Not
end of
on-
Newman.
no.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Alderwoman Tierney?
Hi, yeah, so how do we proceed on phase 2 with the potential redevelopment of City Dock?
That's a great question, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why we push that back. I mean, the most impactful flooding for the city as a whole is clearly compromised.
Yeah.
The
it's
city
something
dock
very
affects
big.
those immediate businesses dramatically, but, so it makes sense that we would do Compromise Street first. But the redevelopment also caused us to say, well, this makes sense to push this back a little bit, and we'll see how that plays out. Well, not much is playing out right now, so I think we have a bit of time to see how that is going to play out before we start the design, since we're not talking about until like next year fall, a year from now.
Did the Urban Land Institute panel reach out to you?
Sure.
They did, okay.
They did, yeah, and we talked to them a lot, and there's options, but if it's redeveloped, then there's great options, because we can locate the control building and the generator inside whatever that development looks like. If it's not, then it's going to be a tough battle to find a good site for that building.
And it would be a comparable size pump,
Yeah, what, 25 by 24?
Yes, the 24 by 24 was the original size when the concept was first developed for both sides.
and is there any design money left?
Yes, so because we've put the north side on hold, we de-scoped all of that from the
Yeah.
current budget, and so we have about $150,000 that's not being utilized.
And that's sort of contingency right now in case things change during the design, but hopefully we'll have most of that left over.
Yeah, thank you.
That's it?
Is it? All right. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Mr. City Attorney, you please present the next item on the agenda?
The next item on the agenda is ID-301-18, an update on the hazard mitigation plan.
I'd like to invite up Director Simmons.
What a beautiful afternoon, right? I'm Deputy Fire Chief Kevin Simmons, the Director of the Office of Emergency Management, and these are my friends. And I'll introduce everyone as they speak. And what I think I'm going to do is, I was listening to the previous presentation, and you all have a grasp of the gravity of the situation. I'm not going to go over facts and figures, which I plan to do. Plus, we we only have an hour to get through some critical information. What I wanted to do is talk about flood mitigation from a macro perspective. You heard the micro perspective with Director Gerald. So if you can go to the, let's go to the slide with House Bill. Kind of start that off. You're all familiar with all the stats, but one of the things I wanted to bring to your attention is, does anybody know about House Bill 1350 and Senate Bill 1006? Basically, by July 1st, 2019, it requires a local jurisdiction that experiences nuisance flooding to, 1, develop a plan that addresses the flood impacts, 2, publish that plan on their website, and 3, submit the plan to the Department of Planning at the state level, and 4, update the plan every 5 years. So this is still in development, and they have not given the locals much guidance on this. But the good news is that the hazard mitigation plan that you adopted in February should meet the needs here. And the next bit of good news is Dave Mandel is on this committee, and I'm pretty sure he will have Annapolis' his interest at heart. If you can go to the next. So when the state asks all of this stuff, and we're responsible for nuisance flooding, and we need to mitigate these issues, it never comes with funding. But, you know, these are the 3 biggest grants that the state, through FEMA, allows: the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grants. Now, the first one there, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, that's the one which we applied, and that's the one we're hoping to get the $3 million. I think we're close. We have to do a cost-benefit analysis on the south side, the first phase of the project. I think that's due, and I think once we get that in, I think we'll start rolling. I'm kind of confident with us eventually getting this grant. We've been working on this grant for a year. Kudos to Dave Mandel, who put a lot into it. The grant itself was 767 pages. So the second one, and I think this is the one that Alderwoman Finlayson was thinking about, is the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program. That's the one where we recently was funded $106,000, which went to a Weather It Together program and our hazardous mitigation plan. We got a contractor to help us with that. Matter of fact, the contractor who helped us with the program was supposed to be here tonight, but she got caught in some bad traffic in Frederick, and she will not make it. So the third one, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grants, that's the one Dave and I are talking about now. The application period closes early next year, and we're trying to figure out what we can apply for that grant. So we're kind of on top of that, and we're very, very aggressive, as you know, with the grants. So, next slide, Dave.
So, good afternoon, Dave Mandel, Emergency Management. Talking briefly about mitigation. Mitigation has become a passion of mine. On the screen you have FEMA's 5 mission areas. And I came across this, and I really think it hits home, because response and recovery obviously it gets a lot of attention, rightfully so. Mitigation, however, as you can see from the slide, FEMA considers it to be the thread that permeates the fabric of national preparedness. It ties everything together, and it's a really valuable investment, beneficial investment in terms of considering the return that you get on these funds. In Annapolis, we have plans for daily, short-term, and long-term flooding. Our daily flood response with the coastal flooding that happens at City Dock and Compromise Street, you can see there, you're probably very familiar with this. Dock Street floods first, and the departments listed there, beginning with emergency management, start coordinating, closing streets, moving barricades, informing the public, redirecting traffic, and so on. That gets put into place. Short-term planning, this is a lot of what we're here to talk about today, is our hazard mitigation plan, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but as you know, the council adopted it this year, and it's good for another 5 years. Long-term planning, you just got a long presentation about that. The flood mitigation project downtown that Public Works is proposing is a very large piece of our long-term plan. So getting back to the FEMA mission areas, they list all these core capabilities here on the left within mitigation specifically, planning, public information, and you see the rest of them. When I started to look at those core capabilities, I realized to myself, coastal flooding connects to every single one of these core capabilities. Coastal flooding is built like almost like a textbook case where mitigation will matter and pay off, because there's every piece of this applies: public information, planning, coordination, you name it. It all comes to bear. And so I think it's a really good example of something where mitigation makes a lot of sense. This slide, I think,
excuse me.
speaks yes, I'm
Question,
sorry.
Alderman Ryan.
Alderman.
Can you remind me again, the one right in the middle, what does community resilience mean?
Community resilience refers to the ability of the community itself to be resilient in the face of these kinds of threats, to be better resistant, to be better prepared, to have protections in place, wet floodproofing, dry floodproofing, the kinds of measures that we're planning on, all goes to resilience. The idea is to build back better, as they say, and be more resistant to difficulties. Okay. So this slide, I think, speaks volumes, and I really like to highlight this whenever I can. I know everyone knows about the flooding and how it's been increasing. We did an analysis in conjunction with the meteorologist at the Naval Academy. We took the data from the sensor at the Naval Academy that takes hourly readings and analyzed for every decade that sensor's been in place, going back 8 decades, how many hours it's been above flood stage. Obviously, it's increasing. Everybody can see that. But take a look at the last set of data on the right. The highest amount of flooding occurred in the first half of this decade, right? That's not a full decade. There are other decades are full decades. But in other words, we've had more flooding in the first half of this decade than we've seen in any full decade in the last 80 years. So that just reinforces the situation that we're confronted with. Chief?
So just wanted the council to know that, all of us have a responsibility with this water thing. And the following Annapolis departments and offices have responsibilities: emergency management, public works, planning and zoning, environmental policy. So we're not working separate, we're working together. We don't duplicate efforts, we support one another. Environmental policy is about to embark on a community rating system, and we're going to back that office up. Again, we don't want to duplicate any efforts. We have a hazard mitigation working group, which we met one time. And I think when Jackie starts up the community rating system, we'll be meeting more to support our efforts. But I just wanted to put that up there to kind of let you know that we got a core group going, and we're working together to mitigate some of these issues. Next slide. Just a little bit more about emergency management. We have, in emergency management, we have a diverse set of skill sets, and this is what works well, because when you're talking about the emergency operations plan, how we respond to hurricanes, floods, snowstorms, all that, that's me. That's my expertise. But also have Dave, who specializes in mitigation, he specializes in planning, and he's a great grants guy. So that combination works well and is supported by our staff. So just wanted to kind of let you know how we were set up with the different skill sets in the Office of Emergency Management. So, next slide.
Rob.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Question, Alderwoman Tierney?
Yeah, just for the public, I guess, what definition of mitigation are you using? Is there a FEMA definition of mitigation?
Can you go
or
back to the
Webster's
very first
dictionary, Well, I know, but yeah. Uh-oh, did I ask a wrong question? Look at the face on Kevin.
So this is actually a definition that I put together.
Oh.
Because it's what it means to me. The management and control of flooding to reduce the short and long-term impacts of nuisance flooding, storm surge, and sea level rise, which affect property, infrastructure, natural resources, and local economies. That's just mine. So. Want to talk traffic mitigation? No. So, we're just getting started. So we have an agenda today. We have speakers. We have Mike Vesley to my left. Virginia Smith couldn't make it, and Dave will talk a little bit about the hazard mitigation plan that you all adopted back in February. The cultural hazard mitigation plan, Dr. Sally Nash will speak about that. And Jacqueline Gow will talk about the community rating system. So I want to introduce Mike Vesley. He teaches courses for both JD and master students in emergency management. He works for the State Department's of Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program and currently worked with over 40 countries on issues of preparedness and mitigation. He is the primary author of the National Capital Region's second strategic plan, which emphasized various aspects of homeland security, including risk management and mitigation. Mike Vesley.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate the introduction. Mr. Mayor, distinguished council members, thank you for allowing me to come and speak about one of my passions. Those of us who get into emergency management, there is something askew in the way we think, because we do all this work and we prepare for these incidents that we hope we never actually have to deal with. So we put all this time into training and planning for fires and floods, but in a perfect world, our jobs wouldn't exist. And David and I both worked for the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security together years and years and years ago. And kind of, David moved here to Annapolis and took on his deputy position here. On parallel tracks, we've both come to the same conclusion that emergency management does not work without mitigation. And the quote that he offered from FEMA is one of two metaphors I'm going to ask you to indulge me with this afternoon. Keeping that idea that mitigation threads everything else we do together, whether it's the preparedness piece in terms of training, exercising, whether it's the response piece in terms of actually deploying first responders to a scene, or that recovery piece where we're trying to get things back to some normal or new normal. So you can advance the slide. So this is the FEMA definition of mitigation. It is the effort to reduce the loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters. It is inherently a risk management concept. One of the, I've been in emergency management now for 15 years, and one of the things that became very apparent to me a few years in was the way certain incidents resonate with the public, resonate with leadership. They might not reflect the true risk that thing poses to society at large. So, all incidents that we deal with can have, grave consequences, but an act of violence resonates much more in the public conscience than a pandemic outbreak, even though a lot more people will die of the flu year to year to year to year. What mitigation work does in terms of risk identification, risk management, it builds a construct and a context to understand these risks in a cool, detached way, and then balance them out against one another, assign values so that you're not just throwing money at projects scattershot, and allows you to create a coordinated strategic effort over a 3, 5, 10-year operational period, so you're not just burning money. When I started writing the first strategic plan for Washington, D.C. and the surrounding jurisdictions, it became very apparent that what we were doing was picking a project here, and a project there, and a project here, and there was no unity between them. So that's great. You might buy down risk for lack of communications for a 1 or 2 year period. What happens at year 3? And how does that interface with what other groups are doing? If the Association of Fire Chiefs are saying we need X, Y, and Z, and the public health and hospital officials are saying we need 1, 2, and 3, how do we balance those needs against one another? Each expert comes into the room and is credible and presents this reasoned approach as to why what they're focusing on should be paramount, but it's hard to contextualize that against the other risks that are also emerging at the same time. Advance the slide. Thanks. So the other metaphor I want you to kind of indulge me with this afternoon is to think of emergency management the same way we think about health of the individual. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the life of any normal human being, at some point there's going to be traumas. You're going to have a broken bone, you're going to need some kind of surgery, some kind of invasive procedures. I tend to think of those activities the same way we think of response in the emergency management context. There is a fire, there is a massive car wreck, there is a structural collapse, or a flood, or a fire, or a need for an evacuation. In those moments, we need to be able to pull together those expertises, those resources, and we focus, they're very resource demanding and resource intensive, and they kind of linger in the public conscience, but they're short. The duration of putting out a fire, it's a short period. Where I think mitigation and preparedness fit into this kind of metaphor, think about like a proper diet, or acquiring health insurance, or getting your annual checkups, or eating better. There's small investments that happen day to day over all, the entire life cycle of a human being, but they buy down the risks from a health perspective that individual faces throughout the course of their lifetime. And small investments, as long as they're well thought out and they're consistent, lower the risk that person's going to be unhealthy at some point and is going to need those traumatic services. We still need them occasionally, still break your arm, but if you getting proper sleep and exercising and eating right, small investments lead to big downstream consequences that have enormous benefits to the individual. I want you to think of mitigation the same way. We invest in these flood measures. Now that's a very intensive project that you all are working on. But there's an entire scope of activities that fall within the penumbra of mitigation, including winter storms, which, by the way, is Chapter 6 in the plan that you guys approved. So that has also been accounted for. But those small investments over time can really dramatically and consistently and sustainably lower the risk profile that Annapolis faces. So as we're trying to develop that context to understand risks, there are three variables that us in emergency management are always grappling with. And I'm going to go through them in reverse order. The easiest one to kind of, and none of these are easy, but the easiest one to get a sense of is value. We don't value all assets equally, and some have, some assets have a value in the sense of this building has historical value. It means something to the community. This church means something to a spiritual community. There are also institutions that they're just by what they do, they rise in terms of value. Think of every hospital that we have, every airport, every port. All of those things have a value. So when we're thinking about risk, the value of the asset in question changes that profile dramatically. Impact is thinking about the size, scope of the event. You guys have, obviously, this flooding issue is something that is, it's touching valuable assets. It can have a dramatic impact. And then the most difficult variable comes into play, probability. Making predictions about what risks are going to be actualized is incredibly difficult. If you want to look at the history of human prediction, the thing I always tell people is think about a time when you've been burned by a weather report, whether you didn't take a coat and it was freezing and raining, or you thought we're going to get a blizzard and it was a unseasonably warm day, even like within a couple hours of a report. And I'm sure we've all been mad at a meteorologist from, one time or another. Meteorology is considered one of the greatest success stories in human prediction. And it messes up all the time. And it's not because we're not smart, and it's not because we don't think a lot about it. It's because tiny variances in variables can have dramatically unpredictable downstream consequences. Changing the humidity in the atmosphere by 1% doesn't increase the amount of precipitation by 1%. It could increase it by 50-fold. So when we're dealing with these probability issues, it's the most challenging component in risk management and subsequently mitigation. David can probably speak a lot about the formulas that were used in developing your plan, looking at historical records, looking at anecdotal reports, looking at insurance reports. There's all different sources. But of the three variables we're grappling with in mitigation, probability is the most difficult one to get our hands on. So here are just some of the common mitigation activities. The Chief spoke about these already, so we don't need to spend any time on that. I just want to put this slide up here just to show you where your mitigation efforts fit from a doctrinal perspective against the rest of the country. David talked about some of the activities that can be taken at the individual household or business level, whether that's, well, within the context of one particular hazard, i.e. flooding, whether it's dry proofing, whether it's wet proofing. The green one just above that, that's where we're at talking about mitigation today. It's what this jurisdiction has put together to understand your risks, develop strategies to buy them down. And then above that we have the state, regional, tribal, territorial plans. Above that we have the federal interagency operational plans. We don't interface with those very much. The only one that's kind of important to be aware of from a local perspective is the planning frameworks at the top. They provide some guidance. They don't scale very well to state and local governments, but they do have some useful conceptual information in advance. I just put this slide up here for two reasons. One, we all know disasters can happen at any time, any place. And the number of disasters that were actually, I should say, the number of incidents each year that we would call a disaster is increasing. The percentage of disasters that FEMA is willing to declare as such and give money is decreasing year by year. And that was a trend that started at the end of the second Bush administration, continued right through the Obama years, and has continued into the current administration. One note that David is going to talk about, but I just want to kind of set the table here. While there are requirements for, obviously there is some monetary investment necessary for any mitigation activity, many of the new federal grant programs require, mitigation is a necessary precondition to even getting in the door for money. So while you have to make these investments up front, they do open the door for future funding. So I just want to talk with the last couple minutes I have before I hand it back to David, just a couple major failures and then a couple of success stories where we've actually seen mitigation efforts pay big dividends. So obviously we all were, we were kind of captivated by the horror of Hurricane Harvey and then subsequently Maria. Houston's long-term planning in terms of how it approached this particular hazard, which was coastal flooding, they had very limited zoning. They had very limited planned green spaces which can absorb excess water. And afterwards, they didn't have a very strong debris removal plan. What we have found is that regions that tend to have a lot of seismic activity and a lot of winter activity are much better at debris removal because those types of incidents generate that material that needs to be removed. Some of the jurisdictions that haven't faced those threats consistently don't have the same kind of debris removal capabilities in place, and you get what you had in Houston, which is the piling up. Obviously, if we're thinking doctrinally about mitigation, the two types of hazards that are the kind of paradigmatic examples of where this plays out historically, it's flooding and seismic activity. That's what mitigation, the various concepts were built around. It's not enough anymore. We have to expand this concept into new areas like tornadoes, droughts, extreme temperature events. That's exactly what your mitigation plan does. So I just want to illustrate a couple examples where some of these risk management mitigation projects have been implemented beforehand and what they have led to. Charleston, South Carolina is, I would guess that if I asked you what risk is number one on their list, you'd say hurricanes, and you'd be right. If I asked you what number two was, you probably wouldn't say earthquakes, but it is. The Columbia Plate is the second most active tectonic plate in the lower 48 states. It runs through South Carolina. Charleston, like Annapolis, is a city that has many, many historic assets that they needed to protect. And you can see when they went through their initial, over the years, the projects they had been funding were all about buying down flood risks. A few years ago, they did a full hazard mitigation program, and they found out that even the small seismic events that they were experiencing were posing significant threats to their historic district. And so what they did was they implemented a series of seismic retrofits on some of their core historic buildings. In India, Atlantic Florida, in addition to hurricanes, one of their big threats was when they went through their risk mitigation, it was all flood, flood, flood. It was the threat that high winds posed to many of their government buildings and their operations centers. So after looking at their risk assessment, one of their key things to implement was high wind shutters that can be erected in a few minutes by any, really it doesn't take any kind of major skill set. 2 minutes of training, and you can install on every single one of their government buildings. They can put these screens up to prevent against high wind damage. The last big case I want to emphasize is Austin, Minnesota. It had a recurrent flood program, and they sit on the Cedar River in north central Minnesota. Their town was inundated by floods every year, every 5 or 6 years. And we're not just talking about the 5 and 10 year floods. They were hitting 25, 50, 100-year floods all in quick succession. These are just two of the different floods that flooded their downtown. You can advance. So what they instituted as part of their mitigation was a loss avoidance study, and they studied 163 of the recurrent flooded buildings in the town. And what you see up there is a grid of their city. And what I like about what Austin was able to achieve was a multi-pronged approach to mitigation. Some of the buildings were condemned, bought, and they relocated people. They turned those into green spaces which are able to absorb floodwaters better. Some of the buildings that had special operational value, were difficult to remove, or had historical value were retrofitted so they could stay in the same spot. So sometimes that multi-pronged approach is what's useful, in addition to things like building pump stations and retaining walls. This graphic just shows what they paid for this is just one small slice of their mitigation efforts, but it shows what they paid in acquisition costs for the properties. Then it shows what the cost would have been to do recurrent flooding repairs based on the size of the floods that happened once the acquisition process went through. I know the numbers are pretty simplified. There's not a lot of doctrinal material there, but it just shows like what mitigation allows you to do is target areas and say what kind of countermeasure makes the most sense here from a community perspective and also from a fiscal perspective. And then what we see here is some of the after effects, new community housing that was developed, as well as green space that's able to absorb some of those floodwaters. The last site I want to point to is Galveston. Bless you. What's considered historic is largely based on where you live. What's historic to Galveston is not what's historic to Annapolis, which is not historic to London, which is not historic to the Middle East, right? We have these different notions of what's important to that kind of cultural identity. So one of the historic buildings in downtown Galveston was their original public library. And after looking at the kind of threat profiles, flooding especially from hurricanes was their biggest threat. The library had been flooded multiple times and multiple collections had been destroyed. So what they did was they targeted their mitigation programs to use that same multi-pronged approach we saw in Austin, Minnesota, but targeted at a single site. So mitigation can be multi-pronged at the jurisdictional or city level, but it can also be multi-pronged at the single asset level. So that's some of the flooding and destruction that occurred. The last slide. Thank you. So what you see here is the after effects of their mitigation project. So if you look where the automatic exit doors are, those doors they're stronger than ordinary tempered glass, so they can be locked down and hold water out, and they can resist high impact. Next to it, behind that kind of where the black metal, the black aluminum is with the tinted glass, there's a white door behind it. They actually built tunnels underneath of the library, so if there's standing water against the library, they can open those tunnels, and the water will be pumped under the building and away, and can even stand there for a while. So if you have to wait for the waters to start receding, the water's not just hitting your ingress-egress points. You can also see that originally that lobby that was destroyed and flooded in the prior slide, all the material that was there. internally within the building, collections were moved away from the ingress-egress point so that, okay, first things first, we lock the doors and hope the water doesn't inundate. If that doesn't work, we open the gates and turn on the pumps and shunt the water away. Third, if the structure's compromised by the inundation of water, we can open the doors and even let the building flood a little bit and allow for it to flood, and we still won't lose any of our internal collections, assets, personnel, electricity, or critical infrastructure. I just want to share this image that Shrewsbury, Massachusetts came up. They got buried by a series of incidents over successive years, and they underwent a top-to-bottom full mitigation risk management revitalization project. And I like this slide because I just want to emphasize, clearly, floods are your biggest threat. I mean, just, you can put the hard data there, but just even common sense. Floods are your biggest threat. But this project, this endeavor, this plan is trying to buy down risks against all your threats, all your naturally occurring threats. And always keep that in mind, that we can't just focus. Unfortunately, the big bad world doesn't let us just focus on one problem at a time. We're trying to address all of them at once. And only through mitigation and risk management projects like this can you get the contextualized sense of where to put money and when.
I'm curious, I was born 10 miles away from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. There's no ocean, there's lakes. What's the problem there?
So they have the, well, first, obviously, as being from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you know they have no county government. They're left to the city and borough entirely. So it's the small town and then the state. Shrewsbury had a series of, well, they had a serious economic downturn coupled with a series of very significant winter storms and then some frontline wind incidents. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
So questions for Mr. Vesey? Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, Dave, and I'll turn it over to Pete Gutwell from Planning and Zoning.
Good evening, Pete Gutwell, Director of Planning and Zoning. I'm pretty much just going to turn it over to Dr. Sally Nash, but as you know, a few months ago, back in April, and prior to that, we had a work session on our Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan, and we sort of want to talk about some of the things that we've done, the Weather It Together efforts, and I have actually an email based on that House bill and Senate bill up to the Maryland Department of Planning, wondering if this Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan that we put together as a resiliency effort qualifies for meeting that requirement of July of 2019, but I have yet to get an answer. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sally to sort of give you an update of things that we were doing, and I think you're all familiar with that Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan, but she'll refresh your memory of some of the objectives and themes associated with it and where we are.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. This slide just shows you the cover of our Weather It Together Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is a component of the Hazard Mitigation Plan. And we pulled out the table, if you remember that, that shows goals, objectives, and actions that really summarize the key aspects of the plan. Next slide. The table that I just referenced has 5 main goals, which are the 5 main goals of our part of the plan. And we've been working to implement those 5 main goals in a few different ways. We've always done a lot of public engagement and public awareness outreach through forums, meetings, and organized lectures. We've continued to do this, especially focusing on business groups. Our economic development manager, Hollis Miner, has spent a lot of time speaking to businesses about how they can be prepared and also how they can embrace economic opportunities that resiliency can bring. So a lot of the companies in the design district, for example, are well suited to be innovative in this field and really lead as resiliency innovators. And that could really benefit them and the city as well economically if we can be a leader in this work effort. For developing response and recovery plans, we've been working on the Hazard Mitigation Working Group and assisting the Office of Environmental Policy with the CRS effort, which Jackie will talk about in a minute. We also have been meeting a lot with Dan Nees, especially Hollis. She's probably met with him at least once a quarter for the past 2 years. He is at the University of Maryland Public Policy and has a nonprofit group that looks at ways we can fund resiliency efforts. So we've been working closely with him with different ideas for the city. And he actually, I think you know, he's been working on a report that he'll have to you pretty soon. He said Thanksgiving, so I don't know if that's, that should be imminent then. Finally, we've also been working on the grants that Chief Simmons mentioned, looking at the economic development aspects of those grants and how economically we can make ourselves more resilient downtown. So, thank you very much.
Any questions for Dr. Nash?
Questions? Thank you, Dr. Nash. So the community rating system, we've been pursuing this for a long time. When we had DNAP, we had a crew from DNAP, from Planning and Zoning, from Office of Emergency Management, and we went down to St. Mary's County, we went to Calvert County, we went to places that are successful with the community rating system to figure out the best way to accomplish it so we can have the maximum benefit for the folks in the city of Annapolis, especially with their flood insurance. So when Miss Jackie Giles got here, she jumped right into it, and we're all here to support her efforts in this. This is important, and we need to do this. So the pursuit of the community rating system, Jackie Giles from the Office of Environmental Policy.
All right, thank you and good afternoon. Jackie Guile, Director, Office of Environmental Policy, and I'm joined by our city's October Employee of the Month, Racine Hodo. Very well-deserved honor for Racine. And Racine is here to supplement what I'm going to say. She is taking the deep dive into CRS and leading it for the Office of Environmental Policy, and she can help me with any questions I may not be able to answer during my presentation. So the community rating system is a voluntary incentive program. It encourages local flood hazard mitigation efforts by cities, counties, and other areas. And it's a program that falls under the National Flood Insurance Program that is underneath FEMA. So it's basically an evaluation process that looks at an area, in our case, a city. It looks at the topographical features, the environmental features, our natural resources, our development, kind of across the whole floodplain area and beyond. And after a long checklist and evaluation process, you receive a rating. And depending on where you fall in the rating, it's kind of like a golf score. The lower you are, the better. Right now, we're at a 9. We're at the bottom because we're not part of the system. But we hope to, as you go up in the system with the better and better rating, you can qualify for flood insurance reductions, discounts in your flood insurance premiums. So it's a method to encourage people who live in the floodplain, who are often required by their homeowners policies to have flood insurance anyway, but they can get cheaper homeowners flood insurance. And also, if you're outside of the floodplain area, you sometimes are required to have floodplain insurance anyway, or you might be a good idea, especially with sea level rise and the kind of storms we're seeing now. So it's a way to encourage people to get insurance. It also would provide for technical assistance to the city in evaluating what it can do to get a better rating, ways we can look at achieving mitigation, and it will help with our database management and our property values as well. So if we're doing mitigation, we're protecting our property, then it will help with retaining property value. If you can get up to a 45% discount in flood insurance if you are at the top, if you have a rating of 1, which we don't have yet. So the process is that you submit, the first thing that we did as a city, and Racine just completed this recently, was what they call the CRS Quick Check. And it's a list of questions we had to fill out about what we have as far as infrastructure and what we're doing as a city, and some basic information about the geography and natural features of the city. And we submit that to FEMA with a letter of intent to proceed with a CRS application. And we have scheduled a community assistance visit, it would be referred to as a CAV, and that should be happening perhaps by the end of the year, maybe in the beginning of the year. And during the CAV, someone from FEMA would come out to the city, and they would interview various staff members. They would do their own visual inspection of the city and look at our flood management regulations to see where we're deficient, where we might need to improve, where we might need to add to the code. So that process would take anywhere from a couple of weeks to a month. And as I said, it could be happening by the end of the year or beginning of next year. When Racine submitted the quick check, we think we come out at about a level 7. And at a level 7, without doing anything more than we're already doing, that would be approximately a 15% savings on our insurance premium rates. Obviously, we'd want to improve that, and going through the CAB process and the application process, we would be eligible to get some technical assistance and learn how we could improve that score. Some areas that we identified already that we think are in need of improvement, we need to provide more information about flood problems other than what we can see on our flood maps. We need to provide information about our past flooding and where our problem sites are. We need to do some things about looking how to reduce flooding, financial assistance, and in other areas we could look into where we would consider preserving our open spaces and natural floodplain areas especially, so that, because they're the most easiest and cheapest method by which to control stormwater and deal with sea level rise. And then the last one is we could require non-conversion agreements. And what those are is an agreement that you don't convert an existing dwelling or commercial building in certain ways. So for example, if you had a large deck you have an exposed basement, with daylights with a walkout basement, and you have a deck above it, that you would not enclose that deck. So the water would continue to be able to flow underneath of that deck area. Also, for example, if you had a carport, you wouldn't be agreeing not to enclose that carport into a garage, again, because you're in a floodplain area, they want the waters to be able to flow through that area. So how we're going to approach the CRS application, it's a very lengthy application, very time consuming. Maryland has a community resilience grant, which we have applied for, and it is a joint funding effort by Maryland DNR, NOAA, and EPA. We've been successful. We were awarded $40,100 to do the application. That sounds like a large amount of money, but it's a very intensive application. There will be a lot of information gathering and interviewing of staff and evaluating our code even perhaps to see where we can improve. So that has been awarded. We are.
Is that work that's going to be done by
the Maryland Energy Administration.
Okay.
They have, Environmental Service, sorry. Thinking about another grant, sorry. There's the Maryland Environmental Service. They have a lot of experience with doing these kinds of applications. We had a draft contract in place with them. The Office of Law is looking at it, and we just found out we got awarded the grant about a week ago, beginning of November. So we need to finalize that contract with the Office of Law, and of course get an appropriation line item for it before we can start receiving, before we can start work on this. And this is a grant that is, you incur the costs and then you submit the invoices and get the money for it. It's that kind of grant. So we've already scheduled the CAB request that's pending. We need to finalize our contract, and then the work would take a year and a half to complete on the application process. Once that's submitted and it's evaluated by FEMA, they verify what we're doing as a city, what we plan to do, and then we get a rating. So we might move from a 7, depending on what we're doing and what we plan to do, on up, on down. That is, you want a lower rating. And then we would know what we can offer, what kind of reductions would be available for flood insurance premiums at that point. So some of the work that Public Works was talking about earlier, the storm drain improvement system, and also the, to the extent the stormwater is improved by the compromise street and market space improvements, that would go towards credit for us in the application process.
Right. Are there any questions?
So questions on the CRS project. This will be great for the citizens once we complete this. So finally, Dave Mandel is just going to talk briefly about the highlights on the city's hazardous mitigation plan, but this is the council's copy, and I'll leave this with Mr. Acting Mayor. But before I go to Dave, I just want to say that I was at a retreat Tuesday and Wednesday of this week at MEMA down in Lusby, Maryland, in the middle of nowhere. And one of the things that they talked a lot about, our hazard mitigation plan, our project down at the dock, and they're our biggest cheerleaders to get this $3 million funding. They're working arm in arm with us, and they want to see us get it, and they're working harder than we are, that we'll get this $3 million. And I'd like to recognize Jahani Ambrose from MEMA, who just came to support us. And she's in the mitigation part of MEMA, and just came here tonight to kind of support us in our efforts here. So, to talk a little bit about the hazard mitigation plan, Dave Mandel.
Okay, thank you, Chief. I'm going to make this very brief due to the time constraints. Mike mentioned this briefly. Approving the mitigation plan, as the council did earlier this year, enables the Annapolis to be eligible for additional mitigation grant funding, both before disasters, pre-disaster mitigation grant, that's the $106,000. The hazard mitigation grant program, which is a $3 million program that we've got the application pending for, and public assistance, that's the disaster reimbursement after the storm. You probably remember the last time we got reimbursement from that was for the 2016 snowstorm. So we are already receiving, we have been receiving for years actually, quite a bit of funding from not only investing in mitigation, but by having approved our hazard mitigation plan. Okay, let me just move forward here. You know about the increases. I love this slide. The ratio of benefit to cost is typically 6 to 7 to 1 in terms of for every dollar you spend on mitigation, you get $6 or $7 back in benefits. That's a famous slide. Brief overview of the plan. A lot of departments and stakeholders came together, weather it together, emergency management, environmental policy, planning and zoning, transportation. Obviously, this is a long process with a lot of input, obviously from the council as well, so we're appreciative of that. Main components, this is nearly a 300-page plan: hazard identification, risk assessment, vulnerability assessments, and what I think is most important, mitigation strategies and implementation. What strategies do we have? There's a 5-year plan for the next 5 years. What are the priorities? High, medium, low. Where should we spend our time? Where should we spend our dollars? So this is a roadmap for how we're going to spend the next 5 years in terms of mitigation. We have integrated this plan with additional initiatives in the city. Other impacts you can see listed there. We discussed about the CRS. This plan was built with CRS in mind, so it is CRS ready for maximum points. We've identified at-risk flood structures. Now it comes to implementation. Here are the priorities. You may have seen this already if you've looked at the plan. CRS, take a look at the highest priority. CRS, we're on our way to that. The flood mitigation, the large project that Public Works presented on earlier, we're almost there in terms of the $3 million grant. And some additional information, the flood mitigation assistance plan the chief mentioned earlier, some additional outreach. So we are well on our way in tackling these types of priorities. At the back of the hazard mitigation plan, there is a list of about 24 funding sources. So we discussed maybe 3 or 4 of them today, but there's about 24 in there. That goes to all the different ways we can receive funds for different types of projects and purposes, and we think it's important for the council to know that. And obviously, we're continuing to pursue grant dollars. That's one of the best things that we do. And I think that's it. Chief? Any questions? Oh, yes, sir. Alderman Arnett.
Yes, thank you. Back at the beginning of your presentation about funding. I'm trying to find the slide. We had a recent, and it was funding for public assistance.
Right.
Incident with the release of all of the debris from Conowingo Dam. And we couldn't help our citizens. Basically, we would take care of things that were on public property, street ends, things like that. But that was a considerable problem. Is that something we can get tucked into our plan and get some kind of urging for assistance?
I'd have to give that some thought. It wouldn't be covered by every possible grant program because there was no disaster declaration, so some of that wouldn't apply. We could certainly incorporate into future planning efforts, like the flood mitigation assistance plan the chief mentioned.
Right. Well, I'm thinking that, but some people actually hired private contractors because you really have to come in from the water to get that stuff.
Right.
There's problems with the depth of the water and so forth. People that are well off on Eastern Avenue got their problem taken care of by themselves, but not everybody has that means to do that.
I would encourage collaboration with higher levels of government on this problem. Obviously, we're a big piece of it, but I know that debris was placed in our area, came downstream, as you know, from a decision from government folks upstream to release, further gates in the Susquehanna Dam, and so I know the governor encouraged collaboration and assistance to Annapolis, but I think there needs to be some additional mechanisms in place that need to be a little more concrete. And I think we can do a lot on the local level, but I think we need to work with the state as well. Yes.
And Alderwoman Finlayson, didn't you bring this up at an LGAG meeting? The whole problem with the debris in Conowingo Dam, when you were talking to the states above the dam that sent us all of that gift.
Yeah, Alderwoman
I took
Finlayson.
actually photographs of our city dock to the last LGAC meeting, which was in Winchester, Virginia. Unfortunately, there weren't folks from New York at that meeting, but several municipalities in Pennsylvania. And strangely enough, they didn't want to talk about it. But we did, and the message was very clear, So we're still having those dialogues, and we'll be together in a couple of weeks, and that will continue. It's everybody's problem.
So our harbor master and public works folks did a fantastic job removing that debris from public areas, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
But there's no question there's a gap when some of that debris works its way into private property. There's no question there's a gap, and we need to work with private property owners, obviously, and all levels of government to try to figure out a plan and incorporate that into our work.
Alderwoman Tierney?
Thank you. You mentioned grants and all, and I guess my frustration is, not frustration, I am sort of in ground zero where I live in Ward 1 and my constituents and all, is being the capital of Maryland. When does our flooding escalate to a state emergency issue? I mean, why don't we reach that level of attention where it sounds like we've got our fingers crossed on $3 million of FEMA money.
Right.
And it's like, hey guys, I think we need 12. Where's the disconnect there?
I think certainly we have ways to go in getting funding. I will say.
I mean, I'm not saying you're not getting enough money. I don't take it the wrong way.
Of course.
So.
I will say, Chief mentioned what a great supporter MEMA has been on this in terms of the $3 million grant. We've gone from having nothing in the hopper 5 years ago to having a possible $3 million from the feds, $1 million received from the state, $2 million more committed from the state. So we're sitting here in Annapolis thinking, where's the money? Let's get this done today, right?
Right.
But that's 5 or 6 million that's been received or committed, or likely with the case of $3 million grant. So we're actually making tremendous progress, even though obviously much more needs to be done.
And thank you for coming, by the way. But the flip side of that too is that they want to see that you have a plan.
Right.
Right? I mean.
And go ahead, Chief.
Yeah.
So just to add on to what Dave was commenting I sat in for a presentation at the Anne Arundel delegation, the start of the General Assembly last year, and they presented about the flood mitigation plan. And they asked the city of Annapolis, did you ask the county for funding? And the room got quiet. And the former county executive said, we have not been approached. So I think we need to look at all available resources. We're talking about the state, we're talking about the feds. Why not ask the county what they can do to help? I mean, that's a funding source as well.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for your time and for your presentation today.
Thank you.
Mr. City Attorney, would you please?
Thank you very
present the
much.
next
The
item on
agenda
the
has been
agenda?
completed, Mr. Acting Mayor.
Thank you. And is there anything else for the good of the order? No?
I move that we adjourn.
All right.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.